Alright, okay. So, our mission was to go to Incheon, South Korea, sail into the Yellow Sea, find the sunken ship, and then recover the bodies and the Manchurian gold. Alright, now, it took a while to plan. First off, we had to get the logistics out of the way. But the logistics weren't that hard. We were going to fly to South Korea and then sail. And then we were going to dive down and recover the bodies. Now, I was already familiar with how to do water reconnaissance because if you remember, during my training, I got to be on the ship and then use sonar reconnaissance drones. But then I heard the news that they wanted me to personally swim down there and recover the bodies and the Manchurian gold. Now, Mia was going to go with me, but they told me and Mia to have special training. And so we spent 2 to 3 days with experienced Navy diver who now worked for Sea Stars, and his name was Ron Ferguson. And Ron Ferguson, that guy was unreal. Like, I thought I could swim before meeting that guy, but he was just unreal. Yeah, he served in the U.S. Navy for a while, and now he came to work with Stars. He was a Navy diver, and when we first got in the water, that water was cold. But he taught me how to put on a rebreather, and then me, Mia, and him just slowly sank beneath the waves, and there's a eeriness to being under the water, you know? But there's also a certain, I don't know, there's a certain beauty to it, but there's also a coldness. I didn't know how to feel about it. And he also told us how to prevent decompression sickness so we won't get the bends. And then after that, after a couple days, he sent us on our way. Although I was a little bit sad that Ron Ferguson wasn't coming with us because he had a mission he had to go to in Japan, which isn't that far away from South Korea, but well, at the same time it was, 2 different countries. And then we were in late February. We were packing our bags to go to Incheon, South Korea. And then at Stars' airport, we met a brand new, fresh out of training, blonde, handsome hotshot named Conrad, Joseph Conrad. And as soon as we start talking to him, he starts saying, "Who's ready to get their cape up on? Yeah. We gonna be listening to that Gangnam Style and drinking some sake, And I said, "Joseph, let's not." And he said, "All right, if you don't want to have any fun, that's fine." And then we got on the Star Jet, and I could tell it was going to be a long flight because I quickly started calling him No Joe. Why? Because I had to say it so many times. "No, Joe, we're not here yet. No, Joe, you can't drink alcohol while on duty. No. No, Joe, I am not that experienced of a diver. No, Joe, I don't do zombies." But eventually, I just started to ask him, Joe, why are you here? Like, why'd you want to do this? And Joe said, you see, I was in college a few years ago, and I was a communications major, but I wasn't learning anything. And so after about a year and a half, I dropped out, and I started to go work at a restaurant / bar. And when I turned 20, which was last year, this bartender, he served me a drink even though he wasn't supposed to, and his name was Richard, and Richard was so cool. And me and Richard, we became good friends until one day, after Valentine's Day, about a year ago, I came into work, and all of a sudden, Richard wasn't there anymore. And I became really worried about him, and I kept on waiting for him to come back to work, but he didn't. And a couple days later, I heard that he died. And I found out he took his own life shortly after Valentine's Day because he never got married and never had any kids. And he had the same job for almost 30 years. The same job, and never got married, never had any kids. Wow. And I just kept thinking about it for the longest time, and you know what? I decided that wasn't going to be me. So I ran away from North Carolina, and I decided to get a crazy job, like a really cool, crazy job that nobody expected. And so I got a job at Stars, and now, thanks to the supernatural tactical administration and reconnaissance organization, I've already completed my 3 months of training, and now I'm on my way to South Korea with you guys. And I can't believe it. I'm just really grateful to be here. And I said, well, we're grateful to have you too, Joe. And then we landed in San Francisco. It was one of our many stops before we would get all the way to South Korea. And then we had to chase down Joseph when he got to the bar. But, to be fair, at the airport lounge in San Francisco, he did at least buy us a drink. He bought us a couple beers. That was very nice of him. And then we got back on the plane, and we had to fly all the way to our penultimate stop in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, yeah, it's pretty, but we didn't get to leave the airport because we just had to stop for gas and some supplies for the airplane. But Joseph did buy us some coconut rum. Very nice of him. And then we finally landed in Incheon, South Korea. What a beautiful city Incheon is. It has a beautiful bridge. It's just a really lit up city. And the Incheon International Airport, it's shaped like a phoenix. Oh, it's so cool. I loved it. But we didn't get to hang out in South Korea that much because we were so jet lagged and so tired that we immediately went to our hotel and just collapsed. And then that morning, we woke up, had some breakfast at the hotel, and then we had a Stars driver driving us over to the docks where we would get on our ship to recover that poor, unfortunate tugboat and the body of Charlie and Joe. Well, our boat commander, because she didn't have the rank of captain in Stars. You see, Stars, the ranking system is very similar to that of the military. You see, Joe was an E3, but Mia was an E6, and I was an O4 at the time because I was an officer because I already had a degree before I joined Stars. And the other officer on board the boat, who was the commander, was Lieutenant Felicity Dubois. And she had a few enlisted guys serve under her. There was a Petty Officer Franks, and he was an E5, and he was a big black dude. But he was pretty cool. He seemed like the kind of guy who just told it like it is, you know. And then there was a E4, and his name was Olson. And he was kind of like the engine guy. He kept the ship's engine running, but he also was the cook on board. And then there was the gunner's mate / master-at-arms, a skinny little E3 who everybody called Junior. I didn't know his real name, though, even after what happened. But I'll get to what happened later. Well, my first real conversation was with Felicity. Kind of went like this. I said, "So, I take it you're the commander here?" And she said, "Captain." And I said, "Captain? Well, the insignia on your arm says you're an O3, which is a lieutenant in the Stars community, and I'm an O4. So, well, you're not really a captain, but you are the commander of this ship. But, ma'am," and then she interrupted me and said, "Lieutenant." And I said, you're right. Lieutenant, you were an O3, and I'm an O4. Now, you may run this ship, and I'm glad that you do, but, I mean, I'm kind of the one who's over this whole reconnaissance project, okay? And she said, "Oh, yeah, like you people always have to be in control." And it's worth mentioning that this Felicity, she was, her name was Felicity Dubois, and she had only been in Sea Stars for about 3 or 4 months. And she was a black woman, but with dyed white hair, with short dyed white hair. And I said, "What do you mean by you people?" And she said, "What, you guys who always have to feel like they're in control." And I said, "What, in control? What do you mean? I mean, yeah, you're in control of this here little shit, but what? But I'm in control. Like, I was assigned on this project. Like, what? I got some details here." And she said, "Huh, yeah, right. Okay, well, why don't you just tell me, like, what we're doing here, and I will get you out there, and you will just follow me while you're on my ship, And I said, okay, but this isn't your ship. It belongs to the STARS organization. And she said, oh, well, I run it. And I said, all right, you're right. And I really wanted to de-escalate this. And I said, okay, how about you just let me do my job and I'll let you do yours. Okay, I think we've come to an understanding. And then as soon as I got done talking to her in the wheelhouse of the boat, and Olsen started up the engine, and we started to pull up out of port, and I mouthed to Mia, and I very quietly said, what's up her ass? Damn. What's up her ass? And then I started speaking to Petty Officer Franks. And he said, yeah, that's Lieutenant Dubois. Yeah, the bitch. Nobody likes her. Because she always feels like she has something to prove. Like she's always has to be the boss. Even though I've been working a lot longer than she has. I've been in Sea Stars for almost 4 years now. And she hardly ever respects me. And I said, damn, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Franks. And then Olsen chirped in and said, yeah, she got a problem with me too. And Olsen, he was a big redneck fisherman dude. He was pretty cool, Olsen was. He was, and he was really good with engines and engine parts. And he said, well, yeah, she treats me like I'm just some dumb old white trash redneck, even though I've been working with engines my whole life. Like car engines, boat engines, lawnmower engines, tractor engines. I've been putting those together since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And she treats me like I'm just some idiot who don't know anything. You gotta be smart to work with engines. You gotta be smart. And then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Mia talking to little Junior, and you could tell Junior, he was a little bit afraid of Lieutenant Dubois. But then I noticed that, where is Joe Conrad? Where is he? And so I went back above deck and I noticed that Joe Conrad was in the wheelhouse trying to flirt with Lieutenant Dubois. And I don't think Lieutenant Dubois was that into him, because Joe Conrad, he had blonde hair and blue eyes. And he gave off frat boy energy. He was a lot like a frat boy. In fact, I think he was before coming and joining Sea Stars. And then I said, hey, Joe, can you help me with the radar and the sonar so we can know when we pull up on the ship? You know, the ship that's below the water now. And he said, all right. And I also said, Joe, did you connect the satellite to the ship so we can call for help? And he said, all right, man, I'm on it. And I said, Lieutenant, I'm a lieutenant. Respect the position, Joe. Joe, I don't want you to get in trouble, okay? Not on your first international trip. Because if, I do give you a bad report, then the STARS agency, they could make it so that you will never represent us abroad again. Is that what you want? And he said, no. And I said, no what? No, Lieutenant, no. And he connected the ship with the satellite, and he turned on the sonar. And Lieutenant Dubois quickly mouthed me a thank you. Anyway, so after we got that turned on, I went down below deck again. To put on the diving suit and the rebreather with Mia. And after we got that on together, I said to Mia, remember that hallucination I was having about you back in Templegate about a year ago? And she said, I don't know, Ethan, you'll have to be more specific. And I said, remember when I saw like a giant red dragon and you were all prego and the dragon was like right up against your crotch? And she said, oh, yeah, I remember you telling me about that. And I said, well, would you ever want to, do something like that? And she said, what, like have a red dragon eat my coochie? I mean, we're near China, so this would be the right place to do it. And I said, no. And I puffed my belly out a little bit, and she said, oh, have kids. I don't know, Ethan. Maybe one day. All right. And then from the intercom, I heard Lieutenant Dubois say, we're approaching a shipwreck. And so, with our rebreather packs on, we trudged up onto the deck. And then we were right above the old wrecked tugboat that had been down there for about 3 weeks now. All right. Well, you ready, Mia? And she said, as ready as I'm going to be, I guess. Are you ready, Ethan? And I said, honestly, no. But we knew what we had to do. So we jumped right into that cold, yellow sea water in between China and South Korea. And it was in late February, early March, so that water was cold. So cold. As soon as you jumped in, it just went down to your bones. But we knew what we had to do. So we quietly sank beneath the waves until we saw the roof and what appeared to be the outline of the ship. That tiny little tugboat. And we swam down, and we could tell that the door of the wheelhouse where they would steer, it was closed, and it was one of the only rooms on the boat. And so we really had to try hard to open that door. We really had to pull because, when you're underwater, all that water pressure makes it really hard to open a door. So we really had to pull. And then, just as soon as we opened it, we saw the gray, bloated mass of presumably what was left of Joe Miller just collapse. And then he floated a little bit. And then Mia grabbed him, and she tapped my shoulder and said, well, she didn't say anything, she gestured. She gestured me to go in the wheelhouse and pick up the Manchurian gold and recover the body of Charlie. So I nodded, and then I went in. And I noticed beside the wheel of the tugboat, there was a brown box, and that was presumably what the Manchurian gold was in, but I don't know, the water around that box, it just felt thicker and heavier, and it just really put me on edge, but I knew I had to grab it. There was no excuse. And then I noticed the body of Charlie still slumped over the wheel of the boat, and his body was just partially picked and bloated, gray, and cold. So I pulled him a little bit and then let his body float up, and I grabbed him by the arm, being very careful not to pull it out of its socket, and started my way swimming back up to the surface. Thank God the sunken tugboat was only about 20 feet below the water. But as I was swimming back up, I was holding the box in one arm, and I was holding Charlie's body by the arm and the shoulder, and then I felt, or I don't know if I saw it or I felt it, but I saw like some gray hand come over my mask and my diving mask, and then I saw the same gray hand pull the box of the chemical, the Manchurian gold, and it was as if it was trying to push it down. And I looked over, and Charlie was still dead, and there was no hand on the box. And in that moment, I felt maybe I could just let this box of so-called gold go and explain that it was an accident and I couldn't help it. And I would have recovered the two bodies, but man, if only I had done that. But I didn't. I made it back up, and Mia helped pick up the body of Charlie, and I put the box of the so-called Manchurian gold on the deck, and I gotta say, it was only about 20 pounds, and it was actually like a lot lighter and smaller than I thought it would be. Man, what could the Chinese and North Korean government be making such a big deal about? And it sure felt good to be back on that deck. And Mia got a towel for me, and I anxiously took off that wetsuit. And then it was the late afternoon by that point, and by that morning, we were going to be sailing back into the port of Incheon, South Korea, and then we were going to put it on the plane and